Hi there. I'm Dustin Oranchuk, and Gustavo Moda has asked me to participate in his class. So I'm just here to talk a little bit about myself and let you know kind of about my PhD and my plans and some of my experiences that I've had in different countries. Um, so I guess what brought me to sports science and kinesiology in the first place was like many people in the field. You start out as an athlete or just enjoying sports or physical activity in general. So when I was younger, I played, like many kids, a lot of different sports, football, both American and non-American, martial arts, weightlifting afterwards, and really, came to love sport. And one of the facilities that I was able to train in as a young athlete had a lot of sports science equipment, timing lights, and VO2 max carts, metabolic testing, things of that nature. And that was actually one of my first jobs, was just cleaning out spit valves and filling up fridges with sports drinks and giving people spots, cleaning up weight rooms, things of that nature. And I thought this was pretty cool, and you got to learn some things and be around athletes and be around other people that are sharing similar interests. And that really kind of pulled me in. So that's where I started, and then I moved on to do my bachelor's degree at the University of Calgary. Following that, I had a brief stint as a strength and conditioning coach for CSI, or Canadian Sport Institute, in Calgary as well. And following that, moved around to Connecticut in the United States to train hockey players, and then over to Colorado, where I earned my master's degree while continuing to coach with volleyball, swimming, some basketball. About halfway through that, I realized I really liked teaching and the research process. So I came back to Calgary for a short time, which is where I met Dr. Moda. And then now I'm in New Zealand, where I'm a little bit over halfway through my PhD and hope to finish in about 12 to 16 months, sort of a thing. Um, so, I mean, there is a lot of difference between Canada, the United States, and New Zealand, which are the three countries that I've studied in and worked in. So I think the primary differences in scientific research between those three places is really where the priorities are and sort of what you're able to get funding for and get support for your research. So starting in Canada, it's especially, at least at my school, at the University of Calgary, the vast majority of research has to do with clinical populations, rehabilitation, or more mechanistic work. So when you're talking about biomechanics, you're talking about footwear science, things where the primary investigators can receive funding from footwear companies, or things like from National Institute of Health or other bodies like that. So looking at mostly ACL reconstruction or concussions. So in general, just people who are injured, who might become injured, so trying to prevent injury, or certain diseases and how to best treat that or improve quality of living with those types of diseases. And not a whole lot of research goes into sport or performance unless there's a direct carryover. So perhaps they might look at ultra endurance to try and get a better idea of neuromuscular fatigue in the extreme state without actually having to get people with neurological diseases that also experience extreme fatigue. In the United States, I think it's quite similar in that regard, but I think a lot more of the universities are teaching based and get a lot of their funding from tuition, where in Canada it's the funding for research is more from grants. At least that's my perception. And then in New Zealand, there is a lot more emphasis on sport, so money from the government or money from different places that allow sport research to be done. So whether that's rugby teams who sponsor PhD students or master's students or netball or whatever it might be, there are a lot more scholarships to go around here, especially based on the size of the population, that allow for direct research on sport, so high performance, trying to get athletes to win and win medals. So that's probably the biggest difference there. And as probably most people know or have heard, the difference between sort of fees is quite dramatic, especially if you're not a United States citizen, or even if you don't live in the particular state, or you're not from the particular state that you want to study in. Tuition in the United States is very expensive, and it's quite difficult to get sort of tuition waivers. So, but it's not uncommon to be able to get like a teaching graduate assistant position, where you would teach a few courses a year and have a fairly full teaching load in exchange for both money to live off of and probably some breaks on tuition. For example, through my master's degree, I went to a very small university that most people wouldn't have heard of, which had some benefits and some drawbacks. Drawbacks because there wasn't a lot of people to really learn from in the research process, but benefits because you got to do a lot of things. You might have been a big fish in a small pond, and it was relatively cheap. But if you wanted to go to a very big sort of prestigious school in the States without scholarship, and you're not born in that state, the tuition can be incredibly high. Canada is much more subsidized, so most people can get a degree and work on the side and come out with relatively little loans, or in some cases no loans, especially if you're able to get multiple scholarships. And in New Zealand, at least for a PhD, most of the time you're paying just in-country tuition, which is relatively reasonable. I was lucky enough to get a pretty good scholarship, so I pay no tuition or fees and get a stipend every month. That is enough to live on bare bones, and then if you work a little bit on the side, then you can afford to kind of travel around or eat a little bit better than average, or whatever you want to spend your money on. I think about the experiences about living in each of the different countries. I had a great time everywhere I've been, for the most part. Of course, there are struggles with being a student and being a scientist. In the States, there's a lot of fun, a lot of things to do. There are many different cities and different cultures in the States. Doesn't matter where you go, every region has its own little country almost. And New Zealand itself is very laid back. Sometimes too laid back, where you just want to get things done, but it takes a little bit longer for somebody to get back to you. Whereas in Canada or the United States, emails come back and forth a lot quicker, and just the process of getting things done is a little bit faster. But some people might love New Zealand for that, because it's more of a relaxed, laid back atmosphere. As far as professional development goes, I think Canada is a great place to be, because you have the opportunity a little bit more to get teaching experience, research experience, and coaching experience if you like. New Zealand, if you come here and you get a scholarship and all that, PhDs are expected to be done very quickly. So the vast majority of your time is expected to be on your PhD research, and not that much time on gathering teaching experience or working outside of the PhD unless absolutely necessary. And I guess what I would give in terms of advice to young people who want to pursue anything in the field of science is, first of all, do better than you think you need to do in terms of your undergrad courses and all of those types of things. Gather your experience very early. So I would say if you can, and you think you might want a career in science and research and whatever else, get that experience very early on. So like I'm talking second, third year of your undergrad, you want to get experience collecting data, analyzing data, maybe even writing. So approach a professor at your school and ask if you can come on in, even just to observe some sessions or help if you can, and ask them questions. Because you might think you want to do it right now, but after you collect a couple sessions of data, or you have to sit through a lot of sheets of Excel and whatever else, you might decide, hey, that's not for me, and then you know right away. and maybe you find that you absolutely love it and that's exactly what you want to do, and again, you know right away, and you can kind of shape your experiences and your paths to make that happen long term. So get experience, and then secondly, do better than you think you need to do. So at least in my personal experience, I did not think I would go beyond my undergraduate degree. So because of that, I just kind of did the bare minimum to get by and pass and get that degree. And then about 6 months after I graduated, or maybe even a little bit before I graduated, I realized, yeah, that was a big mistake, and I wanted to earn my master's, and I would kind of need to earn at least my master's to keep going in the field that I wanted to go in. But by that time, my grades were not going to get much better with 1 semester left to go. And that's sort of why I had to leave Canada and go to a smaller university in the States, because it was quite a bit easier to be accepted and gain enrollment. So no matter if you think you might want to do a master's or a PhD or whatever later on, just do better than you think right now in case you change your mind. Probably the largest significant difficulty about researching in these different countries, there are different issues and different hurdles. I think in Canada, the biggest issue is being able to find money to do research that you are interested in, unless, of course, as I previously mentioned, you want to do research in cancer patients or people with multiple sclerosis, or people who are at risk of knee injuries or things of that nature. You're probably going to have a hard time doing a fully funded PhD project on high performance athletes or just general physical fitness. You're going to need to specialize into those areas a little bit quicker. And I think those areas are absolutely fascinating, and I wouldn't mind at all doing studies on those people, but I think a lot of people would disagree with that, and they don't want to work with diseased populations. So that's going to be a challenge in Canada. Probably less so in the United States. However, there's a lot more universities in the United States, so there's probably a lot more options as far as supervisors and where money comes from, and probably more opportunity to earn money with a teaching, a teaching stipend or a teaching position. In New Zealand, I think the problem is with a relatively small population, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time collecting or recruiting participants. And there's also, because the degrees are very fast-tracked, so we're talking 3 to 4 years for a PhD at most, whereas in Canada or the United States you're looking at 4, 5, 6. So it's very condensed, which is a good thing, but it doesn't really allow for a lot of opportunity to gain teaching experience or other experience sort of on the side. You need to just do your research and do it really well. One of the other differences between countries is just simply the terms that are used. So you hear the sort of terms exercise science, sports science, kinesiology sort of thrown around. From my experience, those all sort of mean the same thing when you're talking about a program. So a program might be officially called sports science, or PhD in sports science, master of sports science, or master of kinesiology, or whatever. But at most big universities where there's enough diversity of research going on, you're going to be able to find something to study that might be classified more towards sports science, which in my mind has more to do with athletes and high performance, versus kinesiology, which is a little bit more of a general term and applies a little bit more towards just movement. So that could be for athletes, or it could be for diseased populations or rehabilitation. And same thing goes with exercise science. That might be slightly more geared towards, people with cardiac issues or cardiovascular problems opposed to elite athletes, but they're all generally interchangeable in my experience. As far as my current PhD studies, my topic is focused on muscle physiology and really the adaptations and short and long-term effects of different contraction types. So of course there's concentric, eccentric, and isometric. And then I'm focusing predominantly on sort of a hybrid of eccentric and isometric. So it's like an isometric contraction where you are yielding. So you're trying to resist lengthening of a muscle as opposed to pushing against an immovable object, and then continuing to try and resist that movement as fatigue accumulates in the muscle. So the idea behind this, which by the way we call eccentric quasi-isometric, is to essentially put the muscle and the tendon under a large amount of total load, total volume, but with relatively few joint movements. So as opposed to having to do 50 eccentric contractions, maybe we can get to the same amount of impulse and load in only 3 or 4 EQI contractions. And therefore we can perhaps cause the muscle to adapt similarly, but with far fewer joint movements, which might be beneficial for somebody coming back from a joint injury, or maybe with arthritis or something like that. And there might be some other benefits in terms of blood occlusion, because the muscle is under tension, so not a lot of blood can kind of flow in and out of the muscle, and that might have some effects similar to hypoxia or blood restriction training. As far as how many papers I'm planning to have after it, I really enjoy doing research, and I actually really like writing papers, and I also know that I want to move on in academia, whether that's a postdoc or some sort of position at a university. So publishing papers is very important to me, more important than most people in my department. So from the PhD itself, probably somewhere in the range of 9 to 12 papers. 2 literature reviews. I've got a handful of like technical notes or brief reports, which are very short papers outlining some new methodology, and then at least 1 paper for the next 4 studies. So I have 4 total PhD studies, and should get 1, maybe 2 out of each of those, on top of the technical reports and the review papers. And then, of course, in total, there will be more than that. I've got a couple of side projects going with the hook grip for weightlifting, as well as a few projects left over from the University of Calgary, and so forth. So in total, from master's times after the master's, PhD side studies, hoping to have somewhere in the range of 30 papers in total, with about 20 of them where I'm the lead author, give or take a few. So very productive. I'm very happy with that. Kind of leading on from the papers and the importance of publication, there's a lot of things that young scientists need to be aware of if they want to obtain a position such as an assistant professor or a postdoctoral research fellowship or anything like that. So to be competitive in Canada, United States, or New Zealand, I think it's relatively similar with some slight variations. So in Canada, I think more than any of the other places, you need to have a very, very strong research backing. So published lots of papers in high-end journals with lots of first authorships. And again, this depends on the university. So there's some universities, like the University of Calgary, for instance, where to get a professor position is very, very difficult, and usually takes many years after the PhD, postdoc, maybe even 2 postdocs, a little bit of luck, and your research has to be in an area that is very important to that particular department. But at the same time, there are universities in Canada that are a little bit smaller, a little more teaching oriented. So they're going to be looking a little bit more at teaching experience and sort of service. What have you done? And are you good at interacting with young people and teaching them, on top of a good base of publications and expertise in that area? I think the same is true in the United States. There are the really big institutes that everybody's heard of. So like University of Auburn is great, and there's Stanford and whatever else, these really famous big research institutes where you need to be like an expert or one of the experts in your particular area to even stand a chance. And then there are much, much smaller universities in the United States that don't really care that much about research, and are more student-driven. In that case, some teaching experience, a few publications, things like that might be enough to have a good, reasonable chance at an assistant professor position. But those schools, again, are much smaller. There's not as much room for growth. Maybe they're not in an area of the country that you want to live in. Which actually brings me to another point, that if you want a career in academia, you need to be pretty flexible about where you want to live. You need to go where the job is. Because unless you live in an absolutely massive city, there's probably only a few jobs that fit that you might want in that particular city, and they're probably full. New Zealand, I think the research profile, especially for an assistant professor position, is quite a bit higher in terms of number of publications, although it probably doesn't have to be in a super niche area like cancer. It can be in many different areas. And down here we have sort of a system where there's like lecturer, senior lecturer, and then sort of a different stream, which is more like a assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. So a lot of times people will start out in the lecturing sort of stream and slowly build up their publications and their H-index and all of these other things, and then they will apply for a promotion to senior lecturer, continue to work on those things, and then once they have enough sort of pull and enough research profile, then they will apply for an assistant professor position, kind of move into that stream. So it's just slightly different, but the important things are have at least a good publication record with lots of first authors, have some teaching experience, and of course the more the better is going to help people out the most. So I hope I've answered these questions sufficiently, and yeah, I look forward to helping in whatever other capacity I can. Good luck to everybody listening.